What if Hitler wasn't an idiot and just ended World War II after destroying most of the European opposition and taking France? First of all, Hitler invaded the West to secure his flank for his real objective, the destruction of his so-called Jewish Bolshevism. So he would not conceivably have stopped. So this is not as easy as it sounds, as Britain remained undefeated and unoccupied, with the Royal Navy still commanding the seas and her empire intact, and would have had little to gain by agreeing to a halt to hostilities. Moreover, the whole war in the West was a sideshow, a prelude to the war in the East. Germany's goal was to seize land in the USSR, to put Germany on an equal footing, or better, with Britain and her many colonies and continental powers like the USA. But let's imagine Hitler unilaterally stops fighting with Britain. The Nazis were both economically and politically living on borrowed time. Plundering the occupied countries alleviated the stress on the German economy somewhat, and the Nazis would have tried to integrate those economies into theirs. But that's not something that's going to happen overnight. And politically, the Reich was a mess. The Nazi system was a patchwork of feuding leaders and organizations, deliberately so in fact, so that no one was powerful enough to threaten Hitler. Germany's economy was a bubble propped up by extracting resources from newly conquered lands. Once Hitler dies, or the German economy nosedives enough, without conquest, the bubble bursts. Even if somehow everyone just stops the war and signs peace treaties, Germany's economy collapses within a few years. After that, either a revolution and/or a restart of hostilities. The UK's strategy was to stay in the war until the US and USSR got involved while defeating Germany anywhere outside of Europe and preventing Germany from trading with the rest of the world. Hypothetically, Germany stays in Europe, starts slowly starving and losing oil, and then gets invaded by the USSR, with Britain and possibly the US landing in the West. Germany couldn't have won the war. It was constantly on the back foot in almost every way conceivable. They won early successes because they were more ready for war than their neighbors, and their population wasn't war-weary. They would have certainly been attacked by the USSR, and probably US too, no matter what they did, and they'd have certainly lost. But then, it wasn't up to him. He knew if the RN still existed, the war wasn't over. So we should not look at World War II through a 21st century lens. The British Empire was the primary superpower with a huge amount of financial muscle and vast resources. Granted, they had to spend all of that wealth to keep the war going, and they were supplanted, obviously, by the emerging US. But that only happened in 1943, 1944 onwards. I'm trying to think of an equivalent situation now. It'd be like a South American dictatorship starting a war, conquering the entire Southern American continent, inflicting a defeat on the US in Mexico, and then saying, okay, shall we call it quits? It was never going to happen. Secondly, his original plan was to gang up on Poland together with Italy and the Soviets, which he hoped would deter Britain and France from following up on their guarantee for Poland. He thought France would do nothing then, as they bordered Italy and Germany, and Britain, alone in this scenario, would also accept Poland's fate, and that's it. But Italy didn't join, and Stalin waited for 2 whole weeks before he sent the Red Army over the Polish border. What should have been a quick 3v1 against Poland ended up being a 1v3, as Germany now stood alone against Poland, France, and Britain. The 1940 attack on France was improvised, after several attempts at making peace were rejected by the Allies. When France fell, Britain was close to accepting the results, but Churchill being Churchill, the prospect of the US eventually joining in, and them already helping with shipments of war material, and Britain not wanting to leave Europe dominated by Germany, made them stay at war. They were somewhat safe on their island, so there was no immediate hurry to end things. Germany wasn't prepared for the war. They had no fleet. The Air Force didn't have the capacity to fight for more than a year or two at max, especially not against an equal and at times superior foe. Hitler never thought he'd have to fight a war in the West. If he did, war preparations between 1933 and 1939 would have been vastly different. Although it was because they had to improvise that they were so successful, especially against France. So there's that. Anyway, the best chance for Hitler would have been not attacking Poland, keeping all the gains he made until 1938, and then sitting out the inevitable economic crash and hopefully surviving the political fallout from it. Given how he was adored as the peaceful unifier until then, it's not that unlikely that he might have actually survived it, politically speaking. But the NSDAP surely would have lost a lot of support here. Lastly, the man who would kick off the Battle of Britain and Barbarossa was the only man who could have conquered the continent. Those early campaigns were insane, hubristic, all-in, and all-or-nothing gambles that by rights should never have worked. Germany's rearmament was an insane, ruinously expensive, debt-financed gamble that produced, in terms of equipment and logistics, an army badly outmatched by Britain and France. Hitler's entire political career was defined by insane gambling and a belief that any and all odds could be overcome by sheer force of belief. Every close subordinate he has is a man who was willing to take part in this aggressive, fanatical gambling, and who had seen it pay off time and time again. The last time Hitler could have realistically changed his thinking about this approach was perhaps at the end of the Great War.